Jordan Peterson's public story is often presented as a dramatic contrast between intellectual certainty and personal vulnerability. Known for speaking about responsibility, discipline, meaning, suffering, and the need to confront chaos, he became a major cultural figure whose ideas reached far beyond academic psychology. Yet his later experiences with serious health problems, medication dependence, recovery, and his family's medical struggles complicated the image many people had constructed around him. His story therefore extends beyond biography. It raises a more difficult question about what happens when a person celebrated for explaining resilience is forced to confront circumstances that cannot simply be solved through discipline, reason, or philosophical understanding. His experience remains unfinished, complex, and deeply human. Early life and intellectual curiosity. Peterson's intellectual development began in a Canadian environment shaped by long winters, relative isolation, reading, and an emphasis on education. Growing up in northern Alberta, he reportedly developed an early fascination with books and the larger questions they raised about human nature, morality, society, ideology, and civilization. His family environment encouraged learning and discipline, while literature provided both intellectual stimulation and a way of understanding a complicated world. Rather than becoming comfortable with simple explanations, he increasingly explored contradictions between order and disorder, freedom and responsibility, belief and uncertainty. These interests eventually became central to his academic identity. The themes that appeared in his later public lectures were therefore not sudden inventions but extensions of questions that had occupied him for years. His early curiosity established the foundation for a career built around understanding why people behave, believe, suffer, and search for meaning. Academic formation and psychology. His academic path moved through political science before becoming increasingly focused on psychology, reflecting a growing interest in individual behavior and the psychological mechanisms underlying social life. He studied at the University of Alberta and later pursued advanced work at McGill University, where his interests included clinical psychology, personality, aggression, and addiction. His academic career eventually included teaching and research at Harvard University and later at the University of Toronto. Throughout this period, he developed a reputation for intense lectures and an analytical approach that connected psychological theory with everyday human experience. He was particularly interested in how people construct beliefs and narratives that allow them to navigate uncertainty. Instead of treating psychology as an isolated scientific discipline, he increasingly connected it with mythology, religion, philosophy, and literature. This interdisciplinary approach became one of the defining characteristics of his later public work. Maps of meaning and the search for order. Peterson's early intellectual framework was most clearly expressed in Maps of Meaning, a dense work that attempted to bring psychology, mythology, narrative, and religious symbolism into a broader explanation of how human beings understand reality. At the center of this framework was the relationship between order and chaos. Order represented familiarity, structure, and predictability, while chaos represented uncertainty, transformation, and the unknown. Human beings, in this view, continually move between these conditions while attempting to create meaningful lives. Although the book initially reached a relatively limited audience, it provided the intellectual foundation for his later lectures and public philosophy. His central concern was not simply how people think, but how stories, values, beliefs, and responsibilities help individuals orient themselves in a world that can become unstable without warning. The rise of a global public figure, Peterson's transition from academic psychologist to internationally recognized public figure, accelerated dramatically through controversy surrounding Canadian legislation and questions about compelled speech and gender identity terminology. He argued that certain legal and linguistic requirements threatened freedom of expression and individual autonomy, while critics argued that his interpretation of the legislation was misleading and that his rhetoric contributed to social polarization. Whatever one's assessment of the controversy, it transformed his public profile. His lectures, interviews, debates, and online appearances reached audiences far beyond universities. He became associated not only with psychology, but with wider arguments about political correctness, free expression, identity, responsibility, and cultural change. The controversy also changed how his work was interpreted. His academic ideas became increasingly entangled with political debates, and the complexity of his earlier research was sometimes overshadowed by his role as a highly visible cultural commentator. 12 Rules for Life and Mass Influence. The publication of 12 Rules for Life brought Peterson's ideas to an even larger international audience. The book translated many of his psychological and philosophical themes into practical principles centered on responsibility, discipline, personal improvement, and confronting suffering rather than avoiding it. Its success established him as one of the most widely recognized contemporary writers on meaning and personal responsibility. Public lectures and long-form conversations further expanded his influence, particularly among people searching for structure during periods of uncertainty or personal difficulty. For supporters, his message offered an alternative to helplessness by emphasizing agency and responsibility. At the same time, the enormous growth of his audience placed greater demands on him. Academic responsibilities, speaking engagements, interviews, travel, writing, and public controversy created an increasingly intense professional environment. The public image of confidence and intellectual control consequently became much larger than the private individual behind it. Health crisis and personal strain. As his public profile grew, Peterson also experienced serious personal and medical difficulties. Accounts of this period describe attempts to manage health problems through restrictive routines and dietary changes, followed by the use of medication for anxiety-related symptoms. Dependence and withdrawal subsequently became major complications, producing severe physical and psychological distress and requiring extensive medical care. During the same broader period, his family faced significant medical challenges, including serious illness affecting his wife, Tammy Peterson. The combination of professional pressure, personal uncertainty, and medical complications created circumstances that were difficult to manage through ordinary routines. His later experiences demonstrated the distinction between understanding suffering intellectually and experiencing it directly. For someone whose public message emphasized responsibility and resilience, the health crisis was particularly striking because it exposed the limits of personal control. Biology, illness, medication, and family circumstances could not simply be reorganized through willpower. Medical collapse and recovery. The severity of Peterson's medical difficulties eventually led to hospitalization and intensive treatment. Accounts describe profound physical and psychological effects associated with medication dependence and withdrawal, followed by treatment abroad and an extended period of rehabilitation. At one stage, he underwent a medically induced coma as part of an effort to stabilize his condition. The recovery process was lengthy and reportedly affected his physical coordination, speech, cognitive clarity, and ability to function normally. The contrast between this condition and his previous public image was difficult for many observers to ignore. A person celebrated for articulating complex ideas with precision was suddenly confronting circumstances in which even basic functioning could become difficult. His gradual return to public life therefore carried a different quality. Interviews and appearances reflected a slower pace and greater awareness of vulnerability. Recovery did not erase the experience. Instead, it became part of the story through which audiences interpreted his ideas about suffering and endurance, meaning, limitation, and the unfinished story. The deeper significance of Peterson's story lies less in whether his philosophy was proved right or wrong than in the tension between intellectual principles and lived reality. His work emphasizes responsibility, meaning, voluntary burden, and the importance of confronting suffering rather than escaping it. His personal experiences, however, demonstrate that some suffering arrives without permission and cannot be immediately transformed through discipline or understanding. Serious illness, medication complications, family medical crises, and uncertainty can overwhelm even carefully constructed systems of meaning. This does not necessarily invalidate the value of those systems, but it reveals their limits. Meaning may help a person endure suffering without guaranteeing that suffering will become understandable or controllable. Peterson's story therefore remains compelling precisely because it offers no perfectly resolved lesson. It leaves a broader human question: how much can philosophy carry when the body, family, and surrounding world begin to fail at the same time? That question remains open.